our government, broke 4 fundamental promises to Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. Or, if not broke promises, behaved in a way that the Russians regard as obscenely lacking in gratitude. The first broken promise, as surely you all know, was that the first Bush promised Gorbachev in 1990 and 1991 that if Gorbachev would agree to the reunification of Germany and a united Germany as a member of NATO, that NATO, in the words of then Secretary of State James Baker, would not expand eastward 1 inch. And on this basis, repeated by the German government to Gorbachev, Gorbachev agreed to the united Germany and NATO. Today, NATO's on Russia's borders. The 3 Baltic states which border Russia are members of NATO. Washington remains intent on bringing Georgia into NATO. It borders Russia. On bringing Ukraine, which is virtually part of Russia, into NATO. This is more than a broken promise. This was a sacred commitment. Washington's answer is the answer of a used car dealer. I hope there are no used car dealers here. My uncle was a used car dealer. Well, he should have got it in writing. And it is true, Gorbachev should have made it codify that commitment in a treaty, and he didn't. And he's faulted for this in Russia very often. But nonetheless, when your government, your president, gives the nation's word on behalf of all of us, none of us feel good about them subsequently breaking the word, particularly if there was no provocation. I mean, if Russia had attacked Germany, then you'd say, well, okay, but it didn't do anything. The second thing is that Russia, after the end of the Soviet Union, was promised repeatedly that NATO would take no strategic military measures in Russia's backyard without Russia's agreement. And you will recall that Clinton, who expanded NATO in 1994, also broke this promise in 1999 when Clinton, though he used NATO troops, but he had no authorization from the UN, bombed Serbia. You remember the bombing of Serbia. Purportedly to make Milosevic stop mistreating Kosovo, which is now a narco state that trades in human organs. Lovely piece of work we created. The bombing of Serbia shocked Russia. The Serbs are Slav people. More than that, they are members of the same Orthodox Church as Russians. They have centuries and centuries of cultural, spiritual, and affinity. This was like somebody beating up your little brother down at the end of the block. And you remember we rained a lot of bombs on them, and they had no defenses at all. And after 70 days or so, they surrendered. Then think back to what happened right after 9/11. You remember that the first person to call the second George Bush was Putin. They were now looking at each other's souls, remember, and liking each other. And Putin said, George, we're with you. This is horrible. Anything you want, we're ready to help you and give you. And they did. When we sent American land forces into Afghanistan, a very, very risky ground war venture, a terrain with which we were unfamiliar, Russia gave us in that military campaign which led to the overthrow of the Taliban, more than any other country, including members of NATO, gave us. They gave us something called the Northern Alliance, which was a fighting force that the Soviet Union had left in Afghanistan after the Soviet army withdrew in 1989, continued to train. They gave it to us to fight for us. It took a lot of the casualties that American soldiers would have took. They gave us overflight rights to supply our troops. They gave us their intelligence, which was still very good. They'd been in Afghanistan for decades and decades. They did so much to help the United States that the Kremlin, Putin, believed that as a result, in return, at last, the American-Russian partnership of equals that had been denied Moscow after the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s would at last be forthcoming, that Russia had proved itself a worthy partner. And what happened? Do you remember what Bush did? No. Well, he expanded NATO a second time, even closer to Russia, bringing in more countries that had once been in the Soviet bloc. And he unilaterally withdrew from the ABM Treaty. You remember the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty? For Russia, that was the bedrock of their national security because it prohibited missile defense of the kind we're now hell-bent on building. This was what Putin and Medvedev meant when they said we've been repeatedly deceived and betrayed. And then finally in August 2008, no matter how much Bush and Rice and Cheney denied it, Putin and Medvedev still believe that in some way we encouraged and supported Saakashvili's attack on the Russian peacemakers in Georgia. I don't know the truth. And they're not going to tell us, of course. Maybe you can get freedom of information. I don't know how that works. So the Russians are badly bruised. And so when they say, we did not create the necessity for the reset, you did, they have a strong case.